The reason I'm doing a live show tonight, and hopefully you can hear me, yes, is that I have switched as I've got out of the cycling season and into the video season to a schedule of trying to get videos up twice a week on Wednesdays and again on Sundays, and both times at 6:45 Irish time. But today, because I've been working on an extra long video, which is part 2 of my cycling from Dublin to St. Mullins on the Barrow trip, I don't have one ready for tonight. I think that video will probably be ready tomorrow, but I may well not launch it till the weekend. And the reason for that schedule actually is because YouTube tells me what time you guys are online and looking at stuff, and 6:45 is sort of the time that sort of picks up. But I also kind of figure that Thursdays and Fridays are not good nights for people staying at home and watching videos. And I see somebody has joined me, so do say hi in the chat. So I was going to talk about a couple of different things. The first of all is how the summer went for me. The last live I did, I think, was the 3rd or 4th day I was traveling around Spain. So obviously I did all that Spanish trip since. And then if you're in on, you'll know this already, the weather was fairly dreadful. I had planned to do the Wild Atlantic Way, or a large chunk of it, but there wasn't more than about 2 or 3 days where there wasn't some promise of torrential rain or terrible storms. So I kind of put that on hold. And what I ended up doing instead was exploring the waterways. So that basically meant cycling the canals and then cycling the canals and the Barrow line. And actually, I'm glad I did that. In fact, I'm going to do all those again because they're very nice. They're less challenging. There's no hills, for instance, which is kind of except when you're coming over at the other end. But the canals in particular, the ascents are very gradual and the descents are very gradual. But they have their own form of beauty, and they do have the advantage that there are plenty of wild camping spots as you're going along. With both the canals and the Barrow was pretty much the case. I didn't need to pre-plan where I was going to camp at all. I could just sort of cycle until I started getting tired. It started to getting near sunset, and I always found somewhere pretty much immediately. It was quite straightforward. So I would recommend those. As I was just saying, I'm going to have part 2 of the Barrow cycle, which is the stretch from Thai to St. Mullins, ready in the next couple of days. It'll definitely be up by Sunday night, maybe on Sunday night. Yeah, otherwise, obviously the Spanish trip was great. I was exhausted by the end of it. I think I'd bitten off a little bit more than I can chew, which I tend to do. And that was partially driven by wanting to get, all the distance done, which is 2,000 kilometers in a relatively limited time window. If I was doing it again, I'd probably try and give myself a couple of break days. I'd intended to do it this time, but I didn't. It wasn't particularly helped because the couple of break days I had built in, well, not break days, but shorter days, turned out to be quite messy. One of which I posted that video about already, where I ended up wandering around forests and swamps, and it didn't go very well. I'm going to come on to questions at the end. I've received one posted to the Instagram account, but you can post questions in the chat as well, and I'll respond to them there. So my schedule for the next few months, I do intend to get out for some cycling. I'll probably take a break in January somewhere south in the Canaries again, and I definitely want to do some cycling when I'm down there. But the focus shifts much more to producing all the videos from the footage I have from the summer, which is about, I was going to say a gigabyte, but no, a terabyte of video footage. And then I've about 1,000 photographs as well, and some audio segments. So that I'm planning to do about one diary type post a week, where I'm covering one of the cycling days. And then the other thing I'm planning to do is a lot of gear related stuff. You'll have already noticed in the last couple of weeks rather, I've been posting some wild camping videos that I shot when I was on a trip up to Donegal. I have some other quite interesting stuff coming up, including a review of a fairly high-end e-bike that I'm getting a lend of in order to review. And I think that should be quite interesting. It's like upgrading from a kind of small camper van to a giant one, and I'll see what I make of that. I'm also going to go back and redo some questions that I see coming up a lot. Like one of the main ones is people keep posting in Facebook groups asking how do people secure their bikes while they're touring. So obviously one of the things people are really worried about is that the bike's going to get robbed while they're sleeping. So I'm going to look at that. TLDR version though is often I don't really, only in cities and only if I'm staying in hotels. I don't know what your experience might be of that. So let me know there in the chat. Um, what other ones was I going to do? Yeah, I mean, I'm actually also interested in what questions people specifically have, like what videos you'd like to see topics on, and looking at running through some of those. Doing the waterways has made me not reconsider, but made me realize that there's a lot of people out there who are quite enthused about doing kind of the greenway safe cycles, the kind of old railway line routes and those. And part of perhaps what I should be trying to do is convince people that some road cycling isn't all that dreadful. And, if you're doing greenways, the networks of L roads in rural Ireland in particular on any of the peninsulas. They're not quite traffic free, but they are fairly safe experiences. You don't want to necessarily do with a 4-year-old child. But yeah, so I'm going to look at some of my existing recordings. After 3 years, I don't know, it must be at least 90 days of touring over those 3 years, maybe a bit more. A useful stove, not an alcohol one. Yeah, so Paul there's asking if I could recommend a useful stove, not an alcohol-based one, and also cooking dining essentials. And the answer to that is no, actually, because I haven't. When I started touring, I brought an alcohol stove with me, and I found that useful on really cold mornings. But I quite quickly realized that actually the palaver of cooking up and taking it down and carrying the extra gear didn't really make all that much sense unless I was touring in quite cold weather, and I was actually quite happy in warm weather, just carrying a supply of easy to eat stuff that you didn't need to heat. And my go-to item for that is actually a can of tuna, some tortilla wraps, and then some mayonnaise or similar, and a few tomatoes or some other fresh ingredients, so that if I hit a situation where I'm between food places, that's what I can live off for the night. In practice, though, that I'm seldom that far off from somewhere, particularly like in Ireland, petrol stations and chicken fillet rolls, which you'll get as cheaply as you would get any sort of meal prep, basically. Chip shops. One of my favorites is actually buying a pizza in a takeaway and sticking it on the back carrier in its cardboard box and then cycling along and eating it. I could look at additional ones. I did buy an Amazon twig burning stove that I thought would be the size of a beer can, but turned out to be something much larger. And that's in my recent wild camping video. I tried to use that up in Donegal to boil some water, but it was being very slow. Now, partially that was because we were using Mary's pots and I didn't want to burn them. So I think I'm going to dig that out and actually see if you build a bigger fire in it, will it boil water faster? I mean, the stove issue does seem to have relatively established answers to it. And like a lot of things, it ends up being how much you're willing to pay. But those sort of fancy triangle type ones seem to be, if you look at people who do a lot of backpacking and a lot of cooking, they're the ones they use. But anyway, thanks for the question. I will put that under consideration. So the decisions I'm trying to make at the moment are in relation to whether I should upgrade my cameras, particularly the GoPro. I have a GoPro 11 after I blew one up in Scotland last year when I went swimming and didn't realize hadn't closed the battery door. So there's the GoPro 13 has come out and the DJI Action 5. So I've been looking at the specs of those two, trying to go, are any of these good enough to upgrade to? And also, is one better than the other? But my major interest is in battery life, because the big challenge of recording all day is none of those cameras really last that long off a single battery. So you end up carrying a load of batteries, and then you have the problem of recharging batteries. And if you're wild camping, you have the pretty major challenge of not really being able to do a couple of days without access to an electricity source to recharge at, and the recharges are really slow. Anyway, that's kind of quite technically boring stuff, but does make a difference in terms of future footage. I did have a question came in on the Instagram, which I am going to look up on my phone here. Oh yeah, unexpected rainy days. Do you hunker down in the tent or pack up wet and go for it? Me, I very much pack up wet and go for it. The idea of hunkering down in the tent for a day is not attractive. I get bored very quickly. The cycling in the rain is a challenge because although I do bring wet gear with me, I think realistically, any wet gear that's lightweight, even if it's really, really good, is only going to keep the rain out for maybe 3 hours, 4 hours at the best. I mean, if you wear sealskin overalls or something that weigh 5 kilos in themselves, they'll probably work all day. But any of the kind of light Gore-Tex stuff, it's got a limited shelf life. So you're going to get wet if it keeps raining for longer than that. So my preference in terms of getting up to a day that's lashing rain, and it's probably going to keep lashing rain, will be to get on the bike, keep cycling, stop in a cafe, dry out a bit, get on the bike, keep cycling, stop in a pub for a few hours, charge all my devices, get online and post things. And that's the way I get through those sort of days. I have found that if I'm traveling, if I have time off in Ireland and I want to do a trip, what I will do is I will have preloaded the weather forecast for a load of towns around Ireland. And about 2 days before I go, I'll actually look and I'll see, okay, so the weather in Donegal is this and the weather in Kerry is that at opposite ends of the country. And I have frequently found that one will have a much worse weather forecast than the other. So the trick is basically get the train to the place that's got the better weather forecast. So I live in an illusion because of that, and a willingness to postpone a trip if the weather's absolutely terrible. As I was saying at the start, I've had to do that a few times this summer. But because of that, I live in an illusion that the weather in Ireland is actually quite good and sunny, and wet days are very rare, even on the West Coast. They're not, of course. If you're tied to a schedule and you've just got to keep cycling, then yeah, you're going to have intense wet periods of time. I would definitely deal with that by making my days shorter and basically skipping between pubs and places I could dry out rather than hunkering down. When I was a kid, I did a lot of caravan holidays with my parents, and it was a very usual experience to be somewhere like Achill Island and to spend 4 days or 5 days staring out at lashing rain. So I don't think it's an approach that would work overall here. So I was saying at the start, I should have the Barrow video ready this weekend. It'll be going up. I've actually, so this is the other thing I wanted to talk about. If you've looked back through my archive or been following me from the start, which is unlikely, you'll know that my very first videos are extremely boring handlebar footage of me cycling around the Wicklow Mountains in real time. So like you've a 3-hour video of me just cycling around, and you can hear whatever noises are happening in the background, and there's no narration or anything else. That's because I started the channel off basically as a way of storing those videos. And then I started to go, I should add some information into these. And I discovered, of course, that if you use time warp on a GoPro, which is that time lapse thing, that the footage is kind of more engaging anyway. And more recently, I kind of realized really over the winter that, of course, my other big interests are history, particularly the kind of Neolithic period, local social stuff, and also local politics. So I've started doing actually worked out narrations that I'm doing a fair amount of work into researching, into kind of what the history is, what's going on, all that sort of stuff. And so when I put the Barrow one up, that's probably got more of that work in it than any of the others. Now, that does add quite a lot of bit of time, because it basically means for every hour of actual video I upload, there's now probably about 8 hours of research. Not sure if that's worthwhile, but it could well be that will end up reaching a much bigger audience and be more long lasting than me cycling around on its own. I am going to retain, as far as possible, doing the full footage of a cycle if I have it, because I know if I was looking at doing routes in other countries, that's what I'd want. I know when I was going to Spain this summer and I was looking at the various greenways and I was going, I wonder how cyclable those are in reality, how rough they are, or whatever else. I did look for footage, and all the footage I found was, basically Spanish language YouTubers standing outside the various Rouen train stations talking about it, and with very limited footage of the actual route. So, I will keep doing that. But what I probably will also do is later on, I'll do re-edits that are much more based on storytelling about those particular routes and the things going on around them. Let me know what you think about that in terms of an idea. It's always a bit hard to know exactly what you're doing with these. And yeah, that's kind of me up to date in terms of what's going on. As I said, winter calms down a bit. I do have a kind of review coming up of a really high-end bike that I think will be quite interesting. It'll be interesting for me, actually. I've kind of, when I bought a bike, I didn't put a lot of thought into it. I knew I wanted something that looks quite like a bicycle, was the size of a bicycle. I wanted to be able to get it off a train or not, but I didn't know much about touring. So I knew I wanted a back carrier. That's about as much as I knew, so I could hang panniers off it. So the Rally Motors Tour that I bought, in lots of ways, actually, it's a good buy. I'm actually quite happy with it. It was also one of the cheapest decent electric bikes I could buy at that moment. I didn't know if I was going to do much touring, if it was just a passing phase or anything else. And even in retrospect, I wouldn't have got a more high-end bike. I don't think that would have made much sense. But I am going to be looking at one that's quite a bit heavier, but also a more powerful motor. So with the Rally Motors Tour, it's only got a 40 Nm torque engine. I think Newton meters might be the unit there. What that basically means is that once you're hitting a hill that's above about 5% incline, you're doing quite a lot of work. Now, I kind of like that because, I wanted the electric assist so I could do touring for more days. I didn't necessarily want it to be easy. I kind of like the fact that the mountains in Spain were a really big struggle, and, Donegal is hard. But it would be quite interesting to cycle something that takes more of the edge off that. So I'm interested to see what that actually looks like. And the other thing I want to do is I have a few friends who do touring on, do we call them analog bikes, proper bikes, old school bikes, whatever the term you want to give to those. And I want to do interviews with them about that. Different experiences between that and electric bike touring. I did do a bit of analog bike touring in the past myself, but I could never last more than 3 days before my legs started complaining more than made it pleasant. So yeah, that's one of the things I want to do a bit more work on, is get more people on the channel, do stuff that's more interview and discussion based. And I've just realized something I should definitely mention, because I am going to do this, is my father, who he's in his late 80s. He was a cyclist. He was a motorcyclist when he was young. Then he was a cyclist for most of his life. And then more recently, as he's got older, health decline and all the rest, he can't really cycle hills anymore. So he bought a conversion kit for his old road bike. And over the summer, he installed that, and he's been out on it a few times. So I want to talk to him about that experience, because actually I think it's really interesting, because he is the classic sort of cyclist who just got too old to cycle, essentially. And this seems to have given him an extension on it. And he did it all himself. Now, he's much more mechanical than I am. So I'm not sure that means that's a terribly easy process. And I know he was cursing about some of the stages of it and being quite difficult. But yeah, so one of the things I do want to do is get him on and talk about that process and going through it. Anyway, that's some of my ideas for the coming couple of months. The channel itself actually has done better than I expected. I mean, I remember when I set it up, I asked people on my other social media to subscribe so I could get to 100 followers. And that's because that would allow me to do live. But then once I was on the road, I realized you can't really do live unless you have a really strong Wi-Fi signal and you've almost endless battery power. And so it's not actually very practical unless you sneakily got a support van following you around or something like that. And I've never had that. So That's why when I started trying to actually advertise the channel, and then during the year I realized I was quite close to making the 1,000 subscribers that YouTube then gives you a cut of ads off, and I've passed that now, and I'm up near 1,400 or whatever. So I'm quite interested in terms of, okay, I wonder where this can go in itself, follow that through. And that then maybe later on, I'm kind of approaching retirement. It's still a bit in the distance, but could enable me maybe to fund some of my travels, partially funded. It's not going to fund a jump. You don't get very much money from it. Basically, at the moment, it's going to buy me a couple of pints a month, which is nice. I'm not complaining. But yeah, so there's that end of the development of the channel as well, in terms of trying to grow the subscriber base and build that out a bit. And the other thing that happens is that as you get a larger following, YouTube treats you expanding into new areas slightly more generously than it does otherwise. It wants you to do this really tiny, precise niche. E-bike touring, in my case, worked because it's a pretty small, precise niche. But yeah, I should be able to kind of spread that out a little bit further and make the topics a bit wider. I said wilder there because that's part of the reason I've been talking about wild camping a bit more. It's very obvious crossover. Lots and lots of cycle tourists are dependent on wild camping economically, for no other reason. It's very hard to do tours of a month or two unless you've either a lot of disposable income or you're going to wild camp. And so that's part of the reason I've actually done that, but also because I've an interest in it in itself. Anyway, I have about 6 of you online there at the moment. So if anyone else wants to post a question, I will happily deal with it. I have Paul Toner there riding a fuel exec here, medium power, 50 Nm max. Recently added the range extender battery pack, so comfortable 70 kilometers or more if managed carefully. I don't know that bike. That 70 kilometers, though, suggests the battery must be relatively small. I know I have two battery sizes. I have a 400 watt hour battery that the bike came from, and then I've actually two 500 watt hour ones. I bought a second one when I went to Scotland. So when I tour, I go with the two 500s. And if I am mean with the assist and the terrain isn't too challenging, I will get 120 kilometers out of each of those. So it reminds me of another video I need to do. Is I bought the Nion control unit, which enables you to set up custom assists. I did an initial test and says, yes, this works. You can get much greater ranges on it. But I've been doing a whole load of other stuff with it this summer, including when I did the Barrow. I realized that the very rough conditions really slow the bike down, make you use more power. So I hadn't brought a charger with me. So I was able to use that Nion to drop the assist down to 20%, which was enough to keep me going, but then enabled me to complete the trip. So yeah, so I'm wondering about your range of 70. That sounds quite small. Paul Willis asks, how do you secure the bike while you're sleeping in the tent? The reason I laughed there is I actually said I'm going to do a video about that because I've seen that question so many times. But I'll give you a summary answer right off. So my bike came with a rear wheel lock, so it's built in, and it basically puts a bolt through the spokes when you activate it. And initially, I'd never seen one of those before. I was like, that's kind of stupid. What would you want that for? But then I realized, actually, particularly with an electric bike, because an electric bike is quite heavy. Mine is like 20 kilos. So it's not something that you'll easily pick up and run down the street with. Particularly with an electric bike, they're quite good because if you're just popping into a shop for a second or a public toilet, you can just deploy it. And it's the same when I'm camping. I'll activate that. That'll go through the back wheel, and it basically means if somebody in the middle of the night is going to come along and try and steal the bike, first of all, the odds are, unless they're quite an experienced bike thief, they're not going to realize it's even there. So the first thing that'll happen is they'll try and push the bike, and they'll probably fall over, or they'll certainly make a fair bit of noise. And even if once they work out that the back wheel is locked for something, they're then stuck. Because what you do with a 20-kilo bike with a locked back wheel, you can carry it some distance, but you've probably already woken me up. You can't get much further. So that's my basic setup. So most of the time when I'm wild camping, that's all I do. I just turn that on. And the reason that's all I do is generally there's nothing else you can do. Like there's not going to be a Sheffield's stand frame, one of those D frames or something you can lock to. Sometimes there's a fence. Or a wooden post, which is not much use. If there's a fence, I also carry a very light but reasonably hard to crack lock called the Abus Bordeaux Light, which is only 440 grams. It's kind of like it's good enough that you're not going to cut it with a small bolt cutter. You're either going to need a big proper bolt cutter, so you're going to need an angle grinder, or you're going to have to be a good locksmith, or there's a couple of other tools will break it. But basically, you actually need to have come equipped to rob a bike. If you're a teenager, you're not going to just rock up and carry it away or whatever. So it does enough for that job. When I'm hotel touring, which I was this summer when I did the Spanish trip, that's completely different. You see some people say, oh, they always find hotels that they can bring their bikes into the room or whatever. I mean, I'm not particularly convinced by the practicality of that in a European context, because lots of, in cities, for instance, a lot of the cheaper hotels, they're on the third floor of a building and there isn't a lift. So with an electric bike that weighs 20 kilos, plus your gear and everything else, you're not going to get it up there. And even if you could, you're not going to want to. So for that, I have, when I use my bike for commuting to work, and it's locked outside my office. I don't have secure parking. So what I have is an Abus Granite X, which is a 1.6 kilogram lock. So this is why I don't bring this touring otherwise. But if I'm hotel touring, I'm not carrying a tent. I'm not carrying a load of stuff. So that saves weight. So I bring that. Yeah, I mean, again, any lock you can cut with an angle grinder. But I think that lock is solid enough that you're probably going to have to change the disc at least once before you get through it. It's going to take maybe a minute or so of grinding, so you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. So when I was in the Spanish cities, Burgos or Santiago or any of the places like that, and where I had to lock my bike outside, I would put that on, and then I would also take the battery off and I take the controller off. So if you want to rob the bike, you're going to be making a lot of noise, and then you're going to get a bike you can't actually cycle, and that's missing core components. That's worked for me so far. I don't expect to work it forever. The first year I also got insurance, which cost me about 220 quid. So specialist insurance. The problem with the insurance, though, is it only pays out if you've got your bike locked to a Sheffield stand with that heavy granite lock. You have to have a gold standard lock. And I realized from my first year touring that the reality was that possibility just didn't exist on 4 nights out of 5. So the insurance didn't really make sense. Right. Okay, Paul, you're telling me about your bike is a mountain bike style with full suspension, so that's probably, I think, yeah, if you're riding rougher terrain, that actually has a big impact on range, for the simple reason that you need more power going up anyway, and you need more power in mud, or you need more power in sand. All of those are going to use more power. But the other thing is that if you're on a road, you can then go downhill at full speed with no power at all. So I found with road cycling, the actual impact to hills is not that big, because, okay, you use more power going up, but then you use no power coming down. But that's dependent on you being able to come down full speed and not having to brake and, all that. And you can do that on a road most of the time. Scotland was actually a little tricky because of the single track roads and passing places. So often you'd have the frustration where you could come bombing down, then there'd be a vehicle coming. So you needed to pull in and stop because the passing place was on your side. But otherwise you get that extra range. But yeah, I can see how mountain bike, if you're doing off-road cycling and you have to use a certain amount of caution going downhill, that you're not going to be getting the same sort of range out of it. Yeah, on locking the bike, I have seen people saying that putting a guy line through the wheel, or even tying it to it, is also a good idea. Because again, if you get a casual thief coming up and they're just trying to, like, I think this ties into the general discussion about wild camping and safety. So I did a video with Mary on that where we talked about that, because when people are thinking about wild camping, often the thing that they find most off-putting, and women for an obvious reason even more so, is that thing of personal safety. What if there's an axe murderer wandering around? And then once you're doing it for a while, you kind of realize that, your average axe murderer, they're going to be going into cities looking for people who are drunk or whatever else. They're not generally going to be wandering around deserted beaches looking for people while camping. And I think the theft issue is somewhat similar, actually very similar, in that if you're a professional bike thief, you're going to go where there's lots of bikes. So you're going to be going into a city, probably into maybe a posh area of a city or near office blocks, and you're going to be looking for, the really expensive bikes with the somewhat inadequate locks. That would be a method. You're not going to be heading up into the Scottish Highlands and driving around places where somebody might be camping and then trying to find out where the tent is and the bike's beside the tent and robbing a bike there. That'd be a crazy thing to do if you were a bike thief. Now, what you might get is local teenagers, or you might get, I don't know, somebody who's just drunk and out wandering, which is the same safety risk, basically, in wild camping in general. But that seems to be a very rare occurrence, I would say. I've heard of almost no cases of that. Famously, there was now 40 years ago, there was a serial killer in the hills above Florence who was killing couples who were wild camping, but that was 40 years ago. And I still remember that story, but it's a one-off. So I think a lot of the concerns about bike security are similar in that the real trick with bike security is to have your bike somewhere where there are no bike thieves. That's the most secure thing, because a bike thief can always defeat a lock. Even really, really fancy lock might take a couple of angle grinders, but the bike thief will always win against the lock. So being somewhere where the bike thieves are not is perhaps the best strategy. And actually, if you're camping in the middle of nowhere, that's probably somewhere where the bike thieves are not. And if there's somebody actually who's looking at robbing stuff, then it's probably more concerning than just your bike, because they'd probably be after your phone and your wallet and everything else as well. That's my kind of opinion on it. It's also, I mean, there's a kind of attitude to risk in general around this. Which is that, I mean, there's risks to cycling, that's kind of obvious. There's a risk of a car hitting you, there's a risk of getting a really bad puncture that you can't fix yourself. There's a risk of, as happened to me once, actually, the derailleur hanger. I got a lift in a van somewhere, got out, cycled, and after about 10 kilometers, when I was in the middle of nowhere, the derailleur hanger jumped into the back wheel and completely demolished both the wheel and the hanger. And the bike just wasn't moving. Everything was seized up. There's all those sort of risks. Those things can happen. You can kind of fixate on them and they stop you doing things because you don't want to take the risk. Or you can go, okay, well, that's just part of the risk of doing this thing that I want to do. I hope that whatever the bad thing is doesn't happen. But there's always going to be a chance. I cannot reduce that chance to zero. That's just the way I have to deal with it. I mean, I live in Dublin. Dublin has a lot of bike thieves, and very professional ones, vans and angle grinders, all that sort of stuff. I've had either 4 or 5 bikes stolen in my lifetime. That's over about, in terms of my active cycling lifetime, that's actually about 45 years. I started cycling when I was very young. So my attitude to bike theft is, of course, I'm going to try and be careful about where I park. And of course, I'm going to try and have an appropriate lock. But I'm still going to have a bike stolen every few years. It's just part of the cost. It's like depreciation or any of those other things. So I guess that's the way I deal with it. And I think that would be my advice to most of the fears around risks with cycle touring in general. You can't eliminate them. You'd drive yourself crazy if you actually tried. And the big danger is it might stop you going on the road at all. Now, I'm not telling you to do stupid things. For instance, if I would never really stealth camp in a city. I think you're far too likely to run into your gangs of drunk teenagers or whatever else doing that sort of thing. But I wouldn't, in rural areas or whatever, I wouldn't really give it much thought. Kind of be careful to be friendly to anybody you run into is about the only thing I would say. You don't want to be winding people up and you don't want to be making people mad, but that's about it. Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's Bob Wizard saying his Garmin 530 has an alarm mode that can notify your phone if the bike is being messed with. I've seen a few things about this. There are also audible alarms you can hang off a bike. And if somebody tries to, if it gets moved, basically, it will then go off. And I could see a use for those in campsites, for instance. I think with wild camping, I'd again have the issue of your problem in that scenario then is somebody tries to rob your bike, the alarm goes off. Okay, so what are you actually going to do about that? Are you going to get out of your tent, get in a fight with somebody? Maybe, maybe not. Is that the wise thing to do? What if it's more than one person? Could often be, are you just going to go, oh, whatever? But yeah, I think I have thought about looking into the alarm, and of course the other thing people do is they put either Apple AirTags into some in the frame or tile trackers or other things. Certainly, if I would consider doing that for touring. I was in Ireland or other countries I was familiar with. Be a bit more wary about doing it in other countries because I wouldn't know how the local cops would react to that. And also, I definitely would not be turning up at wherever the tag was myself and trying to recover a bike. In Ireland, I had a friend who'd not a bike, but the saddle stolen off a bike. And we kind of knew that it was kids from a particular block of flats had done it. So I just wandered in and said, oh, okay, if you bring me back the bike saddle, I'll give you a tenner. And I got it back that way. So, in Ireland, I might do that. But if my bike had been robbed in Spain, even if I had a tracking location, I think I'd be a little bit more nervous about exactly what you might be getting yourself into on that. The hip lock angle grinder proof lock I've seen. I don't think they're actual angle grinder proof though. I think it's just a question of you using 2 or 3 discs on them. You'd still get through them. Okay, is there any questions I'm missing there? It's a bit hard to spot them all. The other one actually that people have asked me about, and this one I struggle with myself, is securing your gear as opposed to the bike. So I'll give you a good example actually. So when I was going around Scotland last year, I went to a few sites that I really wanted to go and see, and that meant I had to get off the bike and go and be gone for a while. So the Old Manor store on Skye is probably a good example of that. There's a car park at the base of it, and then it's about a 45-minute walk to the top and back. And I wasn't going to be carrying it wouldn't even be possible to carry all my gear, and couldn't really bring the bike up either. So that meant I had to lock the bike and most of my gear at the bottom. So my compromise with that is I have a computer security cable. Now you'd cut it with, if you had really strong scissors, you'd probably cut it. It wouldn't be hard to cut, but I loop that through all the handles. And then I take one pannier I bought, turns into a backpack. So it's got, rucksack handles that you can deploy. And I put my valuable stuff in that. So if I'm carrying an extra battery, that will go in there. The tent goes in there. So anything that's really expensive to replace goes in there. And I'll then wear that while I go off. I've done that in a few places. It's been fine. But that's definitely the thing that's most likely to go wrong, is that somebody will come along and rob one of the panniers. Although, to be honest, they're mostly going to be robbing my laundry and whatever I'm eating that particular day. So although it would be extremely annoying if it would happen, I don't think they get much out of it. I don't know. Has anybody got any experiences of actual theft happening to them on the road, or somebody they know? Because it's such a big fear, and it obviously puts so many people off, but it actually does seem to be quite a rare event, in that I've not really heard of it happening to people except in big cities, which is exactly where you expect bikes to be robbed. It's not the I'm far more worried in terms of my cycling of falling off a bike on a back trail in the middle of Spain and breaking my arm or whatever, and it being hard to actually find help because there's no phone signal. I mean, if I was to worry about something, I think that bikes just vanish in Dublin. Oh, I know. As I said, I've had four stolen, maybe 5. It's a nightmare basically. But I wouldn't. If I lock my bike in Dublin, if I do this video I'm talking about, I'm actually going to show you the locks I use, because when I cycle into work, I have that Granite X lock. I have the rear wheel lock, and I also have this big, heavy motorbike chain lock that I leave on a Sheffield frame in work, and I put that through the bike as well. So if you're going to rob the bike, you're going to be spending a bit of time cutting through all 4 of those, and that sort of works. New handlebar sport, yeah, that's great. So meant to do a video on that as well. I got a handlebar bag for Scotland. The problem with it was it my bike does a lot. The brake cables and the gear cables and the electric cables, they're all kind of sticking out in front of the handlebars. So when you put that bag on, it's kind of pushing on the ball. I'm like worried, oh, is that going to damage them over time when because if you think about it, you're doing 2,000 kilometers on roads bouncing around, probably would. So this year I bought a cheap €12 handlebar support off Amazon, which is basically two prongs and a crossbar. It weighs almost nothing. It's like Allen key lock onto it. And when I went to Spain, I used that to hang off the handlebar bag instead. Yeah, absolutely worked. It's a very straightforward solution to that particular problem. You could probably mount things directly on it as well if you wanted to mount additional, I don't know, a Garmin or whatever else. I mean, I don't have a particular mounting issue, but yeah, no, I'm well pleased with that. And I was thinking I should do some more mini reviews of small bits of gear I've got that I found quite useful. Like it was interesting when I posted recently that review of the ergonomic handlebar grips. I kind of just did that because I was going to put them on. And I said, I'll take my camera out and I'll record me putting them on and post it. And maybe there'll be 10 people interested. And then there's like 800 people watch that video or something. So YouTube is a bit weird like that. Like sometimes you get larger numbers of people watching stuff that you think isn't that interesting. And then, my cycling to the Spanish gold mines videos, only 220 people found that one interesting. So I found those mines absolutely fascinating. Not particularly predictable, but yeah, that had me thinking that, yeah, I should probably do more ones where I look at gear in a bit more detail. I mean, the tent review I did, which again, I didn't expect very many people to look at. That not only got lots of people at the time, but I think there's about 80 people a week watch that particular video. So yeah, it's obviously people are actually, I mean, and completely legitimately, they're interested in, if I get this, will it make a difference? Will it actually work? So I think I will spend more time looking at that where I've got things and use them, and I can confidently go, yeah, this actually works pretty well, or this has turned out to be a dead loss. That's probably a good plan. And so the handlebar supports. Oh, sorry, it's those new ergonomic things. So far, I love them. But the thing is, I've only been cycling to and from work. The real test will be when I've done the third day of doing 80 to 100 kilometers a day, because that's when my hands get quite painful. And towards my typical third day experiences, towards the end, my fingertips are getting numb and my palms are stinging. I just got cycling gloves for Spain, and they worked wonders. Really made a big difference. So they made a difference in themselves. So we'll see next big tour I do. Does the combination of the two eliminate that problem altogether? And the Brooks saddle question. So lots of people get that. The Brooks, the nice leather saddles that kind of adopt your own shape and swear by them. I'm possibly a bit unusual that I do not have a saddle problem at all, and I seldom have had. I think it's because I'm commuting maybe there and back. It's about 22 kilometers. So every day I cycle 22 kilometers to and from work. I cycle to the pub, I cycle to the shops. In your average week, I'm probably doing 150 kilometers of just routine cycling back and forth all the time. And because of that, I think I don't really have a problem with saddles, because my skin and my muscles and everything else are kind of adopted to being on saddles a lot. So even when I'm on day 25 of a tour and I've done 2,000 kilometers, it's never been an issue for me. So that, that's just luck maybe in my case, but I do think it's probably the reason lots of people find it is more because they are they're kind of weekend cyclists. I don't mean to say that as an insult, but if you're not cycling much and then suddenly you do 130 kilometers, well, then you're going to be, you're more likely, I think, to have saddle issues. So the investment in the right saddle makes sense. And I am going to be back in 1 minute because one of my housemates just arrived home and forgot their keys. So don't leave. Post some more questions for me. No, got a couple of compliments. Thanks very much. Yeah, no, I'm always a little bit stunned that people do find my witterings useful. I'll try and be useful. Um, but I very much accidentally got into running this channel. As I was saying, I initially just set it up as somewhere to store my really long, boring handlebar videos. If you scroll right back to the first videos I ever posted, um, they're just me cycling around the Wicklow Mountains at normal speed for like 3 hours. So it's just handlebar footage. The Wicklow Mountains are very pretty, but I was just storing stuff. And then I started adding narrations, and I've got some ideas about where to go with it now, but it's quite accidental altogether. So thank you. Whenever people say positive things, I'm always massively encouraged by it, basically, because I ended up here quite accidentally. E-bike model. My e-bike model is a Rally Motors Tour. It's the 2020 model. And I was kind of saying this earlier, but when I bought it, I didn't do much research, right? I knew I wanted to have a bike that looked more or less like a normal bicycle, that was as similar in weight as in shape as it could be, partially because I knew I'd want to get it on enough trains. So I went to Green Air, which is probably the best local e-bike supplier. Had a look at what they had. I also wanted something that was fairly cheap because I didn't know if I was going to keep this up or not. I remember when I bought it, wasn't that? I mean, it was cheap as expensive e-bikes go, but it was about 2,700. I remember buying it and going, God, is this a huge mistake? If I just wasted a load of money here or what? But anyway, so that were my considerations. But I hadn't, apart from knowing that I needed a back carrier so I could hang a bag off it, I had not done much research on it. I would say I'm overwhelmingly actually very happy with that. Like, coincidentally, those were, well, not coincidentally, the things I had in my head as what were important turned out to be the things that were important. Earlier in the call, I was saying I'm going to have an opportunity to test a much higher end e-bike coming up. And that's going to be very interesting. I'll do a video review of it. And I'm kind of not intimidated, but I'm worried about two things. One of them is that I'll do that and then I'll be like, ooh, I really want one of those. But it'll be very interesting because it's a very different bike than mine. My bike weighs, I think, 18 kilograms, might be 19 kilograms, and this one's going to weigh 33 kilos, so much heavier. I haven't looked at the exact length dimensions, but I think it's probably quite a bit longer because it's designed to be a touring bike. And the engine is more powerful. So the one thing that's obvious is going to be the hills are going to be much easier going up. But the other thing that's obvious is that lower assist modes are probably going to feel very different because I'll be moving a 32 kilogram bike rather than an 18 kilogram bike. So one of the things I'm quite interested to do is how it performs with assist turned off altogether. So yeah, that's the kind of but my bike, I mean, as I said, I'm very happy with it, but I wouldn't claim I did amazing research on it. I basically had some basic ideas about what I wanted. I went in, I got it. I just went out and I started cycling then, and went from there. And when a lot of the time with a lot of the discussion of bikes, my attitude anyway, and it's the same attitude to wild camping as you'll probably have seen in the recent interview, is look at what you already have, give it a shot with what you already have. Did you like it? Great. Was there a particular aspect you didn't like? Okay, well, that's probably the thing you need to focus on in terms of the sort of bike you actually want to get, or the sort of tent you want to get. If you found it too small, if you wish there was a porch, if you wish you could sit up in it, I'm talking about tents here rather than bikes, then that's all the sort of information about where you should actually be spending your money. I often think that if you haven't done a lot of touring and you just sat down and spec'd out something very fancy, you might be answering problems that you don't actually have that aren't all that relevant to you. So I'd always start off by just trying out with what you have. Thanks, Paul. Yeah. I mean, I think part of the attraction is probably my somewhat spontaneous ramblings being genuine or whatever, rather than being particularly professionally produced or well thought out in advance. Zippo hand warmers. I presume they're kind of electric powered ones. I mean, what I do have, I don't think I've mentioned them, but they're in some of my videos. is this is back during the pandemic. So that wasn't while camping. Oh, sorry, it wasn't cycling as such, but I got them for while camping. Let me see. Oh, these. So this is from German Amazon, and what they are is they are chemical hand warmers. That the idea is, I think if you're skiing, you use them. So there's pack of 2, and they are, I think it's iron oxide or something. But basically, the way they work is they're airtight. You open them up, they break the plastic, and then it's a kind of little cloth pouch of whatever the chemical is inside. And once it gets oxygen, it starts to heat up, and heats up to, I think it's 50 degrees centigrade. So it actually gets quite hot. And it maintains at least some heat for 5 to 6 hours. So I use those while camping. I always have a couple with me so that if I get a night where the temperature drops right down and I'm kind of not expecting it, open them up and throw them in the sleeping bag with me, and they give me that little push of extra heat because I use a very light sleeping bag. I'm not sure the winters in Ireland are severe enough that you would need hand warmers while cycling itself. I think gloves. Again, I commute all winter, so based on my own experience, there's even a limited number of months where it makes sense to wear gloves. It's normally not that cold, and then there's a few days where it's really cold and you're glad you have gloves. But I think the conditions here, it's not so much of an issue. It would be more of an issue, obviously, if you were going to be touring in mainland Europe, where winters tend to be a lot more severe. Oh. The hand warmers that burn on a small ember, so I presume you're not using them when you're cycling. I'm going to imagine cycling around with a little bonfire with you or whatever. Interesting. Okay, no, I have not come across those before. I must check them out. Okay, right. Yes, yes. They actually sound like they're very similar to the ones I have. It's some sort of iron oxide thing that heats up. Yeah, I mean, like, one of the interesting things I think is the level at which, even after doing an awful lot of this, I still find stuff that I knew nothing about whatsoever on new angles of. And as I pointed out in that video about the ergonomic grips, that was kind of like, old grips worn out. I need to get new ones. Oh, I wonder if you can get better ones than that are just on the barrel. Posting that to the Bike Packing for Beginners Facebook group and getting loads and loads of really good detailed replies with different recommendations and all the rest. So it's definitely the case that there would be a mistake to ever assume you kind of knew stuff. There's always stuff that you learn, kind of. And actually, a very funny example of that is when I did a video about my tent, which is that MSR Hubba NX1, and I had myself putting up the tent in the video, and in the comments somebody pointed out that I had in fact put it up incorrectly, because there's a cross pole in the middle of it that basically gives you the roof space you can sit up. And when you put it up, if you're not thinking about it, that cross pole almost always falls underneath the main bar. But it's not meant to be underneath the main bar. It's meant to be on top of the main bar. So basically, for years, I had been putting that pole up incorrectly and not realized it. And actually, once that was pointed out to me, and ever since, I've been putting it on top, and it actually works much better. So yeah, it's a good illustration of actually paying attention to feedback can be quite useful. I mean, I get a lot of ideas about what to do for the channel in terms of the replies people post to me. Yeah, no, I'm the same. I mean, in terms of growing up, technology is amazing. When I grew up, we didn't have mobiles. Yep, when I grew up, when I was a teenager and into my 20s, and the first time when I moved out of home, we didn't even have a phone. Like, we'd no phone whatsoever in a lot of the places I was in. And in some places, there'd be a phone in the hallway between, I don't know, 5 apartments or whatever. So the way you used to meet people that you knew was you all went to the same pub every Friday night. You drank there, and that was kind of your equivalent of your social network or something, with the people you drank in, the Stag's Head and Dave's Lane, in my case, on a Friday night. Whereas now, we've got these phones which are completely amazing, cameras, videos, navigation devices, everything else sitting with you all the time, with a battery that now lasts all day. It's kind of extraordinary, the level of change that has happened in my lifetime, and obviously in yours as well. I mean, I think Are we too dependent on that as technology? Possibly, but I think it's also meant that it's opened things up for people that, people who can't read a bloody map to save their life have some sort of hope of navigating around the place. And yes, you would hope on if that's what you like, that you wouldn't go up a mountain relying on your phone, because that's a bad idea. But for a lot more routine stuff, I think that is good and it's a big change. Did I ever wake up with slugs in my shoes? Yes, that has happened. It's a hazard of beach camping, actually. Well, it's sand dune camping rather than beach camping. And one of the interesting things I've seen is that there tend to be either slugs or snails, but you seldom get both. But yeah, Ross's Point back in 2021, I think. I have a particularly intense, so there's two intense memories related to that. One is I went swimming at sunset, which was absolutely stupendous. There was this amazing purple sunset. I've used those pictures a few times. The sea was just dead calm. It was mirror-like. It was beautiful. And I had set my tent up and kind of put some stuff out. And one of the things I put out is one of my emergency snacks for cycling is Bombay mix. And I'd obviously left a bag of Bombay mix out of my rucksack and out of my tent. And I came back and the bag had been torn over and was scattered all over the place. And I was kind of like, how did that happen? Trying to look around working. Yeah, were the kids playing a joke on me or what it was? I realized what it actually was. It was a raven had come down, torn the bag open and did it. Anyway, the corollary or the follow-on to that was the next morning when I woke up, the monster munch in the grass had attracted every slug for 300 meters. And it was a nightmare. There were, like, I'd say there must have been 100 of them around my tent, and really big, that sort of size, black, yellow, all sorts of colors. So yeah, I've definitely had these slugs in the shoes. We all right. I seem to be running out of questions, or comments. I'll give people a couple of seconds there to post anything else. But I have been live for 57 minutes. Once again, proving my ability to just natter endlessly. Thanks for tuning in into this, by the way. I haven't done many lives, and I just did this one tonight because I didn't have any other content ready. The Barrow video's taken longer than I expected to put together because it's quite detailed, be ready at the weekend. So I kind of thought I would fire one up for you in terms of doing a live. I might do more of them. I think channels that do a lot of lives have a lot of subscribers. So, because you need the interaction with people basically to go ahead and do them. So thank you, everybody who posted a question or a comment there. Definitely helps, gives me something to talk about. And yeah, I should have the next video up probably, I would say, Sunday. My posting schedule I'm trying to keep to, as you may have noticed already, is Wednesdays and Sundays, and at 6:45 Irish time in the evening. It seems to be a good time to catch people at. And I've got loads of footage accumulated for the summer. So what I'm trying to do is every week I'm going to post a diary, either from Spain or from Ireland, and I'm going to post some sort of technical discussion, how to do something video, interview video, something like that. I'm hoping to get into doing more interviews. I think I have enough followers on the channel now that if I ask people to, if they're interested in doing an interview, they're more likely to be interested. So building it out will be as helpful in that respect. Yeah, so thank you for everybody who tuned in. And now I have to work out how to turn this thing off. If there's an end stream button, it's not that difficult. Anyway, thank you.